Hello, this is Chris Christoff, Director of Professional Development. In this video, we will be talking about the context behind creating a deliberate practice plan. If you remember, last week's video dealt with the rationale of deliberate practice this year and selecting 8 focus elements and sequencing those elements to create deeper learning for students. This week, we're going to apply that concept to creating a deliberate practice plan. Once you have selected your DP focus element, there are 3 questions you'll have to ask and answer. The first one is, what learnings will I want to go through to get better at this element? It is perfectly acceptable to write things in that box such as study on this element, read about this element, visit the Marzano resource Canvas page to get better at this element, coaching, etc. What we want to do is move to question 2 and talk specifically about how am I going to implement this element in order to get better at this element. When thinking about how am I going to implement my focus element, think back to what was stated in last week's video. We talked about elements never being thought of as standing alone. All these elements are in the context of sequencing lessons to promote cognitively complex tasks and moving students to that DQ4 event. In order to do that, we would need to understand what that cognitively complex task is. And as we design those activities to implement getting better at that element, we really need to understand that and then plan backwards to see what those elements will look like. In order to illustrate this better, I've invited Phil Kupchak, supervisor in professional development, who is a former math teacher and a math coach. So Phil, talk to me about this cognitively complex task that was in this particular math lesson.
All right. We had just finished the how to find the area of quadrilaterals, specifically rectangles and squares. And the next learning target was surface area. And I didn't want these students to have to do a bunch of worksheets and using rulers on paper and what have you. I wanted to engage them more. So what I decided to do is have them figure out the surface area formula on their own, because with the back then the FCAT formula was very difficult for them to understand, and they didn't have the ability to go from the abstract of the formula to the concrete. So what I decided to do is to go from the concrete to the abstract. So in this case, what I did was I took off some boxes and I covered them with some butcher block paper. You can use them plain, and I gave them out to the students, and I basically asked them find the area of the entire box. Use what they knew with area and just to find the area of each of the boxes. So I gave them the boxes. They used their rulers, tape measures, and markers because they got to write right on the box, and they decided how they were going to find the area of the entire box. And when then they brought the box back to me, I checked it for I gave them a slight error range in there, and if they hadn't were able to explain how they got their the area of the entire box, I gave them a second box, and I asked them to not only find the area of this box, but also to come up with a formula for finding that. And when they brought their boxes back, they really had to explain their formula and what they did. And then the third time, I gave them their third box. I had them go back. This time they couldn't write right on the box. They actually had to just use their formula to find the area of the boxes.
So if I hear you correctly, what you're saying is that cognitively complex task was given to them at the beginning of the lesson?
Yes, I did not tell them the word surface area, and I did not give them the surface area formula per the FCAT reference sheet. I just gave them the box, went over how we find the area of rectangles and squares, and asked them to find the area of the entire box.
So let's connect this to lesson segments addressing content. You basically gave them that DQ4 event, element number 22, right at the beginning of the lesson.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, let's put that now. I'm going to ask you a couple questions because I want to talk more about now the focus elements. Obviously, one of our focus elements is element number 1 under routine events. You clarified the learning goal, and I heard you mention learning targets. So you actually had learning targets presumably in a scale.
Correct.
Okay. So now let's move into element number 6. And let's say since element number 6 is one of our DP focus elements, I didn't hear you say that you identified the critical information literally at the beginning before that, but tell me how once they created their boxes, maybe after the first box, how did you intentionally identify critical information for the students so that they were sure and you were sure the essential learning was happening.
Oh, absolutely. One of the things I didn't want the students to get hung up on was the actual vocabulary. So I told them at the beginning just to find the area of the entire box. So after going through that series of 3 events, they had some concrete examples of what they were doing. So afterwards, when I did identify the critical content, I did specifically say the entire area of the box is called surface area. I identified the critical content afterwards. But then they had some kind of background knowledge and information that they could attach that critical content to.
Okay. So let's move. We have our Domain 1 framework here, and our next prioritized element, or let me go to number 12, helping students support and represent knowledge, because I did hear you mention this. So sequenced in this lesson, showing how identified critical information is not a standalone. You told me that you gave them markers in ButcherBox and they were writing on the actual box itself. Tell me what they were writing and how you monitored that work within recording and representing knowledge.
So one of the things I had them do is obviously covering the boxes. Is the first go around was very rough because I didn't give them a lot of direction. That was intentional. I wanted them to struggle a little bit on that. But what they did was they went around on each box as I went around to each group, and they wrote exactly the formula for each square all the way around. So I was able to monitor that they knew the formula and that they were recording and representing that particular for each side of the box. And then what I did afterwards is when I had them explain it, they had to show me where they came up with the total. And they showed me each face of the box, each side of the box, and they were able to explain the total to me.
Okay. And obviously, I would assume as you're walking around that room, this is new content for them.
Mm-hmm.
Even though you're giving them that cognitive complex task first, you're probably asking them as you're walking around, elaborate on this. I need more information on this, and maybe even asking some of those inferential questions that come within that. Would that be accurate?
Yeah.
Does that happen?
Yeah, absolutely. The nice thing is we had just covered the basic how to find the area of a square and rectangle, so I was able to monitor that they were doing that correctly, and then if need be, redirect and guide students back in the right direction. But also as they started to formulate their own formula in their head, is to go through, and I would just make sure I asked basic questions to prompt more thinking, especially when they started going in there and I saw one group only had 5 numbers when they were adding. I said, how many sides are there to a box? Mm-hmm. And then so they would count the sides. I said, so what's your formula? So just that probing, just to get them to realize that it wasn't anything they're thinking, they just forgot a side of the box. But overall, the lesson was going as planned, so I didn't have to do a lot of redirecting. So that always makes it nice.
So bringing this back to deliberate practice, I just want to show what was illustrated in that short conversation about what Mr. Kupchak said and what he had in that element number 22. He designed that DQ for cognitively complex task prior to engaging in the lesson. In fact, he gave it to them first. So he used the word struggle. I would call it productive struggle. They were struggling with that content. They were making their ways, but he pre-planned ways that he was going to identify that critical content. What he did there was he did that verbally. He told them what the critical pieces were after every time they made the box through that progression. He had them for a way to make notes, and he was going around and monitoring that. He also could have done a quick little lesson with certain students that were writing down. If they were way off, he could have done some redirection right there. And he was asking them some elaborative type questions to make sure not only did they understand that, they were applying it correctly. So those 3 elements were all contained in there. Now, when we're talking about deliberate practice, he certainly, the next time around, if this is a similar type of lesson, he could try a different way to identify critical information if that is his chosen DP element. He could choose a different way, a more explicit way on having students elaborate on new content, or he could choose a different way to make sure kids were representing their knowledge. What he would want to do in this DP plan, depending on the one that he picked, is he would want to continue to monitor that the chosen strategies within one of those elements were reaching the desired effect. So if Phil had some way of knowing, did that way identify critical content really, really have the kids be able to then answer the question, can the student actually identify what's critical and what's not? He then knows whether that strategy worked, and he could try a different one to see which one worked better. That really takes us to question number 3 on your deliberate practice plan. How are you going to monitor to make sure that those desired effects are being reached on a consistent basis? Now, one of the easy ways to do this, before I bring Phil back into the discussion and talk specifically about that lesson again, is to make sure that in your professional learning communities, you're building that DQ4 cognitively complex task event. You're building that first, so then you know what those learning targets are that you have to take to get to your level 3 on your scale. You're also planning out, sometimes with the PLC, sometimes not, those formative assessments that that good teachers do every single day in their classroom to make sure kids are understanding the content. You could certainly use formative assessment data to see if you are getting better at sequencing these events and actually targeting some specifically to an element. But you could also do targeted towards that element, did I do this correctly? So I'm going to turn it back to Phil and ask, let's just say element 6, keep it simple, identifying critical content. Did you have a way built into that lesson that you were making sure that kids were able to use your strategy of verbally connecting them with the critical content to make sure they were getting it? Did you have a way to monitor the desired effect of that element?
Absolutely. And I can add a second piece of the critical content. Obviously, one of the critical pieces of surface area is knowing and being able to use the surface area formula. So I was able to identify that critical piece. And what I had the students do is use the FCAT reference sheet formula for surface area and actually go into design question 3 elements of having them examine similarities and differences between the formula that they created and the surface area formula on the FCAT reference sheet. So they were able to take that the critical information I was giving them and apply it to what they have already been doing.
Okay. So there was some built-in thing. Were you taking notes on kids that were getting it and kids that weren't, or is that something you maybe did the next time? Was there a way to capture the essence of that element happening?
Oh yeah, as I'm going around in the groups in the moment, using my iPad to use the student tracker that was created to quickly do a quick assessment of students and where they're at, and through the dialogue and questioning, obviously monitoring, there's a lot of questioning that needs to go on. Sometimes you can see stuff, but it really, when you're dealing with cognitively complex tasks, it's the reasoning and the explanation that goes behind it. Do the students truly understand what is being asked of them, and can they explain it in a way that they know exactly what's going on, and it's just not surface level knowledge, that they really had that deep understanding.
Right. So let's say at the end of this lesson, Mr. Kupchak reviewed his notes and realized that, you know what, I had to do a lot of correction when kids were answering back to me what they thought the critical content was. That means that next time, for growth purposes, you might want to choose a different strategy within that focus element of identifying critical information. And the same would be true of any other element you picked. So you're not only going to plan how to use strategies within that element, sequenced with the other elements, remember, but you're also going to plan, how am I going to monitor that element is actually working, and always look at that through the lens of the student. Do I have a way to monitor the desired effect? In summary, the purpose of this video was to show how you take your focus element and create your deliberate practice plan. We talked about the professional learnings you might engage in. We talked a lot about the implementation and how that would work when you're sequencing with other elements, all trying to get students to cognitively complex tasks. And then we talked a little bit about how you're going to monitor to make sure not only that the DP activity and focus element is happening, but that you're improving as you continue to use that element. We sure hope this helped you. Please let us know in the professional development department if we can ever be of service. Thank you.